Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mechanical Muse Live. This is Mark, here to talk to you about all sorts of gaming things, and especially right now about Cool Name Goes Here RPG, our big project at the moment that we're working on. So I'm going to tell you about a few different things that we're doing. I'm going to share a little bit of information for you about some cool things we've discovered, and we're going to talk about a number of things: spellcasting, box sets, all the rest. So mail call, sadly, there's no mail call this week. Nothing good showed up in the mail for me, so I'm a little disappointed about that. But what are you going to do, right? It's the best you can do is hope for something to appear, but sadly, nothing appeared this time around. So maybe next week I'll have something cool to share with all of you. But that said, let's talk a little bit about what game night has been like. We're continuing to play Cool Name RPG. The game has been a ton of fun. The jungle has proven to be a brutal, horrible green nightmare of a place for the characters to exist in, which is both good and bad. You know, it's really up to you on how you want to think about that. And I guess my players might have a different point of view on it than I do, but keeping in mind that one of the things that we're working very hard to do here is that we are trying to really push the limits of this system and do some very specific testing to figure out exactly how things work. And so that's really important to us in all of this that we're doing and making sure that this is something that's going to work well. Now, when I say pushing the limits, let me give you an example. The party is effectively a first level party. And I gave them an opportunity to fight an Umber Hulk. I say it's an opportunity because, of course, why not? But here's what's interesting about what happened when they fought the Umber Hulk. So first off, they're desperately outclassed. If this was 5e, they would be in very, very big trouble. It's got armor class 18 in 5e. It's got like 90 hit points. This thing is a beast and difficult to fight. Get 3 attacks per round. I recognized that this was going to be deadly. I recognized that this would be hard, or at least it should be. However, I also didn't want this to be an instant bloodbath, because here's the thing: players are going to make mistakes. And if the system is completely unforgiving, it's not going to be a lot of fun when those mistakes come around, because those mistakes are going to knock the players down and it's going to be a hot mess by the time that you're finished with it. So I wanted to make sure that our system will encourage players to make smart choices, will make sure that they are, going out there and playing their characters well and being thoughtful. But at the same time, there has to be a certain level of forgiveness built into the rules. And by forgiveness, again, I don't mean easy, but I do mean it needs to understand that players will make mistakes and they need to have time to learn from them. So what happened with our encounter? The party, first of all, was actually able to harm the Umber Hulk a little. They had a couple of open-ended rolls that went really well. Now, we had one guy who was playing his character pretty independently. He was being pretty solo about the way he was doing things, and he was relatively effective. He managed to get in a few good hits. He unfortunately took a bad fall, jumping a 10-foot down onto loose rubble, and it took some damage there, but didn't take him down. He made his checks against the wounds. But what I did notice was that the team was most effective when they worked as a team. When teammates were trying to eliminate negative modifiers by assisting and clearing obstacles, if they were trying to add benefits through an aid, if they're trying to assist another player, that is when they had the most effect on their enemy. That's when they reduced the challenge score the most. And that was actually pretty fantastic. At the same time, it was really interesting because we had a similar scenario earlier where everyone was working together and they ended up with a plus 17 to the action score. Now, you might say, that's crazy. I mean, plus 17, and that's because someone open-ended on an assist. It was a real lucky break. But in the end, the players still only rolled a total of 9, which was enough to succeed, but it didn't blow the game out of the water. It didn't completely unbalance things, but it did give them an advantage that they needed. It allowed them to be successful when they might not have been on their own by working together. And it was a moment that could have been a lot bigger than it was, but it was still cool and fun. And had it been even bigger and more successful, sure, everyone would have loved that as well, but we still had a good time playing it. So anyway, with the Umber Hulk, they managed to get in a few hits. They managed to do some damage, and the Umber Hulk managed to get a hold of them and drag one of them through the floor and start dragging him along towards a pit. Well, all of this worked out pretty well because people took some hits. People got a little bit nervous. Things looked a little bad. Their vitality scores ended up going down a bit, but they still had time to go, we're in big trouble. We need to get out. And they did. They managed to escape. They withdrew from the combat, and the game system supported the type of adventure we wanted people to have, an exciting, action-packed Indiana Jones style adventure against crazy monsters using cool abilities. Worked really well across the board. That was really a really fun thing to see in our game. Now, tonight, I'm going to be talking especially about spellcasting. But before I do that, I want to talk about one other thing. So I want to talk about when you're trying to make a game and the challenge of trying to make a game if you're an independent creator. It's hard. There's a lot of work involved. Even with us, we've got, a number of people working together, but it's still really hard to do. And one of the things that comes up is the cost of doing this, because it is expensive to get things like good layout, good art. These things cost money. They should cost money if you're doing them the right way. So how do you do this? How do you make it work? Well, one of the things that I want to encourage people to think about is stock art. There is some beautiful stock art available, and it's not that expensive in terms of how much you're spending to create your stock art. This is actually, the prices are amazing. And I want to share one of my favorites with you tonight. So let me go ahead and try to share this really quick, because it's just really cool. And I definitely want you to see it. This is Publisher's Choice stock art by a gentleman named Rick Hershey. He does some amazing, amazing stuff. And I just really I want you guys to be able to see some of the coolness of what they're doing here. Look at this art. This art is absolutely beautiful. This is amazing stuff that would look good in any book that you put it in. And this is just a sampling. Let me just flip through. I mean, look at these Hyborian Age pieces. Yikes, made my show a little not appropriate there, but I'll edit that out later. But look at this piece. This is just a gorgeous piece, amazing art, looks fantastic. You could write an entire story or side quest adventure just around this character. And it's like $10 a month to get access to all of these for your gaming projects. There's no reason not to use some of this stuff that's out there. Eric Lofgren is another person who has some really incredible stuff. I mean, this stuff is just great. And I hope that you guys, if you're looking to make your own products, that you will consider looking at art like this one, for example. Here's some great backgrounds as well that he's providing. But, great backgrounds, great character art, lots of opportunities to make great games, and it doesn't cost an arm and a leg. The idea that it's too expensive to do it right, it's just not true. I mean, there's amazing stuff. And what's more, folks like Rick and Eric Lofgren, they're on DriveThruRPG. You can get their stuff there as well, and it's super affordable. Now, what you don't get is you don't get a independent, like your own copyright. Other people can use this art. That's kind of the nature of stock art. So if you're creating something, it's not going to be just yours in the sense that you say, well, this is always going to be what my creatures are going to look like. Well, other people could use the same image. But first off, it doesn't happen all that often. Second off, if you're just getting started, this is a great way to get started. You don't have to do this forever, just until you start selling your books, and you can hire an artist to do it. And the third thing is that you have a right to use this, and people don't have a right to copy what you created, which is an issue that's kind of a outstanding issue on AI art today, which, aside from my personal feelings, I'm not going to get into that tonight. But the reality is that AI art, you do not at the moment have pure copyright protection of what you create and put out there, because they have judged that in the courts, there's been precedent that you can't own it. So that makes it really tricky if you're putting it into your books. It does get tricky. So all I'm saying is that there are some opportunities, and I hope folks will take these opportunities to create amazing stuff. We're going to be using some of this in Patreon. We've been writing up some monster stats and things to go with these, just because I love them. They're gorgeous, and it's a great way to put out some really cool products, especially if you're on a budget. I mean, anyone could afford it who's putting a game out. You could have a blast doing it. So enough of that. Let's talk about spellcasting. I promised you that's what we would talk about tonight. Cool Name RPG. As most of you know, this is the game that we're making and giving away to the world for free. One of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit more about is spellcasting. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you about spellcasting. We are not completely finished writing up our spellcasting rules. There are gaps, and I'm going to share some of those gaps with you as we go along. Now, I did ask Steve Long, a guy who has written for pretty much every game. You might know him from a hero system. Pretty much any hero book you look at, his name's on the front of it. He's looking at our spell system right now. He's going to give us some feedback on how we can do some of these things that we're struggling with. But we're looking for all of you to share your ideas as well. And that's part of what our first contest is going to be. I'm going to be announcing our first contest soon. It's going to be a spell design contest where you design your favorite cool spell and you build it out in advance so other people can just use it and play it. So let's look a little bit at our spellcasting, though, to better understand how all of this works. So I'm going to pull up our rules here. Let me go ahead and grab those. And we will start talking about spells and spellcasting. So I'm not going to go through how spellcasting works necessarily tonight because we've kind of talked about that already. But one of the things that I want to encourage is that when you're creating spells, you want to start thinking about this in terms of, first, what cool thing do you want to do? But then, why do you want to do it? Right? So let's say I want to put ice on the floor. Well, that's cool. Awesome. Just by itself, you just create ice out of thin air and put it on the floor. I love it. But why? What is the point of the ice? And the character might say, well, I want it to impede our enemy so they slip and slide and they can't get to us. And it's more difficult for them to defend themselves. Like, okay, so now I'm starting to get it. Well, if you go back to our list of the list of actions that we've got here. So we're going to jump back over here to our action types. What you're really telling me is that perhaps you're trying to cause them to have an obstruction, a +1 difficulty to their action checks for when they're standing on this ice. That actually sounds like what you're really saying. Or if it's movement, maybe we're saying we want to slow them down and the GM can give you a little bit more of a in-between type of answer on how to do this. But quite frankly, most of the time, it's going to come out in one of these different actions. This side I should be pointing at. So let's say I want to do something like, well, I want to cast bull strength on my friend. It's like, well, what's the goal here? He's like, well, I want them to do more damage when they hit. I want them to be stronger so they can lift up that gate. I'm like, oh, so what you're really talking about is using magic to create an assist, in which case you're going to improve the action score for yourself or an ally. So using a spell to create an assist. When you start to think about it, all magic is just about creating mundane effects using magic and at range. Now, this can be applied again and again and again in all sorts of different ways, not necessarily just with these either. For example, what if I want to heal the vitality of one of my friends? Well, that's a good question. How do you heal vitality? Well, let's take a look here at our combat rules. And if we go to vitality, wounds, and healing, we have something called a first aid action. This is something that normally you would use your intellect and maybe an MO like cleric that has healing abilities. Well, in this case, what we are doing is we're replacing all of that with magic, right? That's all we're doing. We're replacing all of that with magic. And so instead of making their intellect, which it should say intellect, not intelligence, typo, instead of saying intellect as the primary attribute, it would still be intellect if you're a wizard. But if you're a cleric, it might be one of your spirit abilities, for example, right? And you're not going to be using your healing MO. You're going to be using your spellcasting MO to add to this, right? And your spellcasting focus as you go to cast a spell. The difficulty will likely stay the same. You'll also be adding a difficulty for how far away the target is. At a minimum, you're going to have reach, which is going to be a difficulty score of 2. But then you add in the difficulty, which in this case is the number of body wounds if you're trying to heal them, right? So again, it's the same thing. It's the same system. It's the same rules, but you just are using magic instead. Now, of course, as you probably know, if you fail your magic roll, the amount you fail by is going to be vitality damage to your mind or your spirit, depending on the type of spellcaster. That's the cost of being able to do anything. You can do anything, but at a cost. And that's how the balance of this game system works, is that when you're playing the game, you have to decide, is this going to be really hard and difficult? And really, am I putting myself at risk physically if I do this, where I'm going to take a lot of magical backlash if I fail and I have a good chance of failure? At that point, you have to ask yourself, is it better to use magic or a mundane approach? But most of the time for wizards, especially with a minor spell casting action like a light spell or something, Cool Name RPG encourages the spellcasters to use magic, and that was something that was super important in our design. If a wizard lights a torch every time they want to light up a room, that kind of defeats the purpose of being a wizard. Wizards are all about using magic. They're about pulling this magic out and causing the crystal to glow on their end of their staff, right? That's what being a wizard is all about. And if we take that away because we put some sort of unrealistic and sort of artificial limiting factor in place, we immediately encourage the wizards to do other things than actually using their magic, which is what makes them who they are. And once they're using other things, at that point, why are they a wizard, right? So I think that's super important to keep in mind, is that we want to find ways to say yes to the players. We want to find ways to give them an opportunity to use magic in cool ways and use the abilities that they have. In fact, that's kind of the truth across the game, is that we want to give each player the ability to use their MOs in a way that benefits them and lets them solve the problems using their MO, as opposed to trying to use some ability or skill that another character might have. So let's talk now a little bit about targeting, and I'm going to talk about one of the gaps that we have today. We've talked briefly about this before, but area effect is one of the areas where we're still seeing a little bit of challenge. How do we handle area effect spells? Do we have a +1 for each 5-foot square? That seems pretty excessive, because that's going to get real expensive fast. Do we have +1 for each 5 foot away? And part of the problem here, keep in mind, is now we start talking about having to do measurements. So if you're the type of person who enjoys the theater of the mind combat we've been using so far, that's not going to work for a base system for you, right? So how do we figure out how to expand it in a way that's realistic, from a not realistic, but well balanced from a game perspective, right? Something that's going to feel right while still having a cost to it, and not be the thing that they go to every time because it's easier than anyone else doing anything, right? That's the other side of it. If magic becomes, everyone just looks at the wizard, says, go wizard, that's not fun either, right? We don't want either of those outcomes. So how do we do that? That's one thing we're looking for. We'd love to hear people's thoughts on that. As you're play testing, we'd love to hear what you try and what works, because that's still a puzzle. And this is one of the puzzles we gave Steve and said, dude, we just don't know what to do about this. Help us out with this. The other thing that's a little bit challenging sometimes is a question of, here's a scenario that came up in our last game. Characters are hungry. They don't have enough food because they lost all their gear running from that Umber Hulk I mentioned earlier. And they don't have much to eat. So they find 3 little crayfish in the river. Well, the wizard thinks, what if I was to enlarge those crayfish, and then we'd have 3 big lobsters effectively that we could have for dinner? And everyone thought this was a fabulous idea, and they decided to try it. So what does that mean? Well, one way that I could interpret that is that this is a strength assist. In other words, you're trying to make the crayfish stronger than what they were by making them bigger. You're increasing their body score, right? Interesting. That's an interesting way to do it. That's what I thought I would try, and that was fun and all. Of course, then the player open-ended and added 10 to their strength, and so then I had to enlarge them to a giant size, and they had to fight giant crayfish for a few minutes. But that aside, as much fun as that was, the reality is we came up with another problem. When you grow something like that, it's not permanent. When I do an assist using a spell, I have to maintain that spell in order for it to continue to affect my friends. And that adds +1 to my difficulty. But what happens with these? When you release a spell, do they shrink back down? Does the meat get small again? Does it stay the same size once you kill it? It created a lot of weird questions for us that we had to start trying to answer. So this is one area where we're still trying to work things out. Things like permanent effects. What is a permanent effect? How does it come about? And how do you empower this effect so it keeps going after it's done? How does it make it more costly? What is the cost for this? There are lots of questions here we just don't have the answers to that we're trying to play out. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the ideas we've had and that have worked relatively well. The whole growing crayfish thing immediately set my players to talking about ways they could abuse the system. And one of the ways they wanted to abuse the system was and in the best possible way. That's why we're all here, right? We're trying to test this out. They're like, well, could we shrink down a boulder really small and I could maintain it and we get someone to drink it in a drink and then I could expand it inside them? Well, yeah, I guess that might work, but that doesn't really match the spirit of what we're trying to do. So, is there a way that we can encourage people not to do that while still letting them do the cool things they want to do? Right. In other words, how do we not prohibit that, sort of blanket prohibit it for no good reason, other than the fact the system isn't doing what we want? How do we put a system in place that encourages people not to do that? Because there's a cost. And one of the things we came up with, for example, with that is you might be able to reduce the size of a boulder, but that's only one piece of magic. What about the weight? The weight is something else entirely. So it's all well and good to reduce that boulder down to this size, but it still weighs the same weight it did originally. So their big plans of feeding it to someone or placing it into a sling and throwing it and then enlarging it suddenly became much less feasible. Now, on the other hand, one thing that did come out was the idea that if you have the wizard casting a spell and then the rogue throwing it with a sling, what you've actually done is a good thing because you've encouraged players to work together and you've created teamwork that creates a much more rich and exciting game than if you're just having the rogue just throw rocks over and over again. Now everyone's working together and coming up with creative plans that they can use in the game. So how do we do it? Maybe we add another spell for decreasing weight. But then how does that work? Because that doesn't really fall into one of our categories of things, right? So there are some questions that we do need to answer. I'm not exactly sure how we're going to solve these yet. We also thought about maybe saying if you want to decrease the weight of something, that's effectively an assist to the strength of whoever picks it up. So now you have a affects everyone spell. Anyone who goes to pick it up is effectively stronger because the rock weighs less. So it gets a little complicated, but keep in mind that what we'll be able to do is take these and turn them into pre-written spells for folks who don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of spell design, right? Now, spell design is what our first contest is going to be about. So we're going to be encouraging you to come up with cool, creative ways to twist and use the rules to create different things. But for now, we're trying to figure out how to get this all to work, and there are some questions that we need to answer. Another thing that came up was the floor was collapsing underneath one of the players. Well, one of the characters said, well, I'm going to cause a invisible arcane floor to appear underneath him so he doesn't fall through to his death down below. Pretty great. But how do you create a floor? The way that we played it is that in order to, you were effectively repairing the floor. The floor was damaged. You wanted to repair the floor. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to look like that, but as a GM, that's the way I'm thinking about it. I'm going, okay, they're basically repairing the floor. So the floor is damaged and they're healing it. So basically what you're trying to do is the equivalent of a first aid check on the floor using magic, and the amount that they make it by tells us how solid that is. If he had made his roll and open-ended it and ended up with like a 15 effect, that's like basically making the floor solid as a rock. And as long as he holds it, no one's going to fall through that. If, on the other hand, he gets an effective 2, it's sort of holding the player, but they still better move because it's all coming apart at the seams and there's holes in it and things. So what we ended up with was something that actually was pretty cool in that we didn't need to create floor. Instead, we had a character said, I'm going to put an arcane force there, and their level of success, their effect, determined how effective the spell was. A higher level wizard probably would have had more success creating that false floor to hold up their companions. So that's just another example of how we've been putting these pieces together in order to create spells. Some of the challenges we're facing and some of the things that we're going to have to take a look at as we go forward. Especially one of the big things is, how do you have a affects everyone spell? And that means things like an ice sheet that anyone who walks across it is affected. A disguise spell that anyone who looks at you is going to have difficulty recognizing who you are, right? They're not going to see through the disguise. Or a polymorph spell that permanently alters the shape and form of someone. Do we need to have some additional action types to use for constructing spells that we're going to be using when we put together our instructions for designers and for modders? We might. So that's all I have to say about magic for tonight. I'm not going to go into a whole lot more detail on that, but this is the type of challenge we're facing today, and this is part of why I want to start with a spell design contest. Now, before I talk about my last topic of the night, starter sets, I do want to just talk about a couple of things here in terms of what's coming in the future. First off, I am going to be out of town and completely incommunicado from about March 20th to the first couple days of April. During that time, there's a very good chance I will be unavailable, partly because I'm going to be in England and I might be trying to look up some folks while I'm there. So if you're in England, give me a shout out. But I'm going there and I'm going to be away and it's going to be really hard to keep up with things. So things are going to go a little bit quiet for them. But all of those assignments that we sent out to our consulting designers are all due to come back that first week in April. So that week, when I come back, we're going to have some very cool stuff to talk about. So I'm looking forward to that as well. We're also aiming to take that feedback we get the first week of April, fold it into the rules, and then do another edition, another version of the rules and get those out. That version should not be significantly different, but will hopefully be richer, larger, and more complete than the one that you have today. And that's the one that we're going to actually, hopefully, be sending out to places like EN World to start getting a wider audience looking at this and get some more eyes on it. Because the more people we get looking at it, the more people we get liking it and playing it, the better our chances of getting games written around it. Okay. And the more games there are to play with this, the more fun we'll all have. That's kind of the whole idea at the end of the day, right? So that's our plan right now. That's what we're working toward. In the meantime, visit us on Discord, visit us on Facebook. We're going to keep talking to you guys there, sharing the stuff that we're coming up with and sharing the things that we're building out as we go along. So last thing I'm going to talk about tonight is starter sets. And the reason why I want to talk about these is that they've been on my mind because I'm thinking about how we present the material for Cool Name RPG. Because one of the things that really was like huge for me, and probably a lot of you, is this right here. This set is what made me a gamer. Well, playing AD&D with a guy on a summer program was the first way that I became a gamer during school. But this was the one, this is the first book that I owned for D&D. It was this box set. And what was amazing about this was how much we played it. We didn't just play it once. We had whole adventures and ongoing campaigns using nothing but these rules. And to me, that is an exceptionally successful starter set. I recognize that maybe you want to try to force people to buy things if from a pure business perspective, but I don't feel like gaming is that sort of a business. I feel like we're all hobbyists. We're all in a niche market. We're all in this together, which is why I'm doing Cool Name, right? And so I'm trying to think of ways to present the games in a way that the starter set lets you go forward beyond what the set contains. Now, there are a lot of starter sets out there that have just, enough to play one or two adventures, right? And this isn't necessarily true of the ones I'm showing you here, but these are some of the ones that I've enjoyed lately that I've picked up. The Doctor Who starter set, the Blade Runner starter set is a good one as well. Let's see what else I've got here. Oh, the RuneQuest starter set from Chaosium, great set. Pendragon, another great set. The Alien starter set. All of these were really great systems and sets and a great way of introducing you to the game. They aren't all, though, equal in terms of being able to replay the game. A lot of starter sets these days are literally a starter set. They get you started playing the game, and then you need to buy the other books to keep going. I really like the idea for Cool Name of our basic rules, our starter rules, being something you can run with forever and you'd be fine. Maybe we do a box set someday. I don't know. Maybe someone else does a box set. One of you out there will want to do it. But that's one of the things I want to think about. And I don't know what you guys think. Tell me what your thoughts on starter sets are, right? Do you love them? Do you hate them? Are box sets like your thing that you love? Or box sets sort of like, they're a good novelty, but I don't really use them that much, right? I think just because that's how I started gaming, I am a sucker for box sets. And as a result, it's very hard for me to resist a good box set. But it is interesting to think about that. I'm also curious about your thoughts on, is it better if the game can be played long-term using just the rules in that box? Or is it better if it's just a very focused adventure where you play out one adventure and you learn what it's like to play the game? Can you do both? I don't know. I think this is interesting, and I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this. One of the things that I do know that was very cool about the red box, as people call it, was that they had this solo play in there, right? We probably, almost all of us, played through that solo play adventure at some point, those of us who are of a certain age. And that adventure stuck with me my whole life. Is that an important aspect as well? Being able to actually play out some of the scenes. GURPS had some solo play in it in their rules. So that's another thing that I want to think about is there a place for solo play within the starter set rules? Because we are working on solo play material, if you remember from our Kickstarter. So it's just an interesting approach, something I've been thinking about. I don't really have as much time to talk about as I'd hoped because I talked too long about spellcasting. But at any rate, that's it for tonight. I'm just going to call this good. Thank you all for watching. I'm trying to keep it short and sweet because it seems like folks have 30 minutes, but not an hour to spend on something like this. If you've got things you want me to talk about, please let me know. Mention in the comments, go to Discord, go to Facebook, tell me what you want to hear, and I'm happy to cover the things that you're the most interested in. That's it for now. Hopefully your games continue to go well, and thanks for being part of this. Take care.